in time of your busy lunch schedule to join us in this Lunch and Learn series that we are launching regarding the California budget process. This is our very first of a series of 3 Lunch and Learn segments. With us is Scott Graves, and he is the budget director of the California Budget Policy and Budget Center. That's what it is. And he is going to take us through the journey of very high level on the California budget process in the state of California. The center has an amazing outreach and engagement component to it. And we are so fortunate and blessed that Scott is the director of that and allowing us to tap into that resource for us to bring you this very first of 3 segment series on the California budget process. My name is Sylvia Rodriguez. I neglected to mention that. With us is the Hornets Policy and Politics Alumni Association chapter. And I am Sylvia Rodriguez, the president-elect. So without further ado, let me allow Scott Graves to do his magic. And welcome everybody. And one more time, thank you so very much for lending us your time, lunchtime today. Have a great lunch and learn time.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sylvia, for the kind words, and thank you for inviting the Budget and Policy Center to be part of this meeting today, where I will be providing a pretty high-level overview of the state budget process, and also hopefully leaving time for any questions that you all may have. I actually, unfortunately, can't see you, audience, so I'm a little bit more disconnected than I would like to be, but I know hopefully you are out there, you're listening, and if at any point I've said something that has struck you as like curious, or you have a question about it, please feel free to drop questions into the chat, and our moderators will be funneling those along to me at various points during the presentation. So again, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so I can bring up my slide deck. Hopefully this will come off without a hitch. How is this looking, moderators?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, what I want to do is over the next maybe 20 to 25 minutes, provide a high-level overview of California's process for developing our state budget each year. This is a presentation that we do throughout the year, and it's a bit shorter than our standard presentation. I've ended up dropping a lot of slides, so it's even less in the weeds than it typically would be, just due to time constraints today and wanting to leave time for Q&A. But my hope is that for those of you who feel like you're not that familiar with the state budget process and you want to learn a little bit more about how it actually works, who the key players are, what the timeline is, I think this presentation is just for you. Some of you may have signed on who have been around the block, so to speak, on the state budget process in various ways, and maybe it's not that much of a mystery to you. But my hope is that there will be something that comes out of my presentation that you will find somewhat enlightening and maybe newsworthy to you, maybe something you hadn't realized before. So hopefully all of you, if you are actually eating right now, since this is a lunch and learn, if you are having lunch, maybe there will be that learning component attached to this. And of course, at any point, I just want to say now, if you ever have any questions about the state budget or the budget process, please feel free to reach out to me either tomorrow, next week, or throughout the year. We are here to help answer your questions so that you can advocate for the kinds of state budget choices that you want to see reflected each year. So let me go ahead and get started. What are we going to be doing today? Well, first I want to spend a little bit of time reflecting on why the state budget matters. Then I'm going to review just a few key facts about the state budget. Next, I'll be looking at who the key players in the budget process are. And then finally, I'm going to close by talking about the budget process timeline and opportunities for public involvement throughout the year. So let's get started. Thinking first about why California's state budget matters. So I'm going to do something maybe a little odd here because I can't see you. And I was hoping we might be able to have like a little bit of a back and forth here. But if you feel compelled, if you wouldn't mind dropping into the chat, why does the state budget matter to you? When you think about the state budget, what is it that you are most invested in, or what do you think in terms of the state budget's value to California, what the purpose of the budget is? So I'm just curious about that. Our hosts are going to share your, whatever thoughts you happen to share will be shared with me later, not right now because I can't see anything that's going into the chat, but that's often a question that I will ask the audience when we're moving into this part of the presentation, just to get us thinking about that. So from the Budget Center's perspective, one thing we always like to emphasize from a very high level is that while yes, budgets are certainly about dollars and cents, if you ever manage to crack open a budget bill, you're going to see a lot of numbers in there. You're going to see some very large dollar figures in there. But at the end of the day, what it all comes down to is budgets being statements of our values and priorities. Someone's values and someone's priorities are always being reflected in the state budget. The question is, whose values and whose priorities? And that's what's getting debated every year when we talk about the state budget. It is true that budget choices affect all Californians, right? Do young children have a safe place to play and learn while their parents are at work? Do young adults have an option for an affordable, quality higher education? Do seniors and people with disabilities have the ability to live with dignity in their own homes and communities? And really so much more. So each year, budget deliberations that happen in and around the state capitol are really aimed at answering this question. What kind of California do we want to live in? So no matter what the issue is, no matter what the underlying debate is, this is what it's all coming down to. This is what the budget debate is essentially adding up to, trying to answer this question and always adjusting and modifying it every year, right? What kind of California do we want to live in? That's the question we're trying to answer. So let me move now into the next part of the presentation where I wanted to review a few key facts about the state budget. And this is a part of the presentation where I've pulled out a lot of information that I would typically include here. So you're getting a more scaled back version of this. But I did want to provide some high-level facts about the state budget just to make sure we're all on the same page here. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the state budget is made up of both state funds and federal funds. And for a lot of you, this probably isn't news. For others, you may not think about the federal funds part of it, but particularly in a year like this, where we have the Trump administration, we have Republican control of Congress, at least nominally, some major and very damaging policy proposals on the table. We're waiting to see what happens with those. There are some serious potential implications for California, for our state budget, and for Californians. So it's really important to be thinking about the federal component of our state budget. So Governor Newsom, as you know, released his proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year that starts on July 1st, just a couple of weeks ago, a little more than 2 weeks. And when you roll it all up, it's just under $500 billion. So what I'm highlighting here on this donut chart is that we have a lot of federal money that flows through our state budget. So the governor's estimate at this time, and this is assuming, right, current law and policy. This is not assuming any deep reductions that may be on the table in Washington, D.C. So if everything were to go, if we were in sort of a normal year, we might expect around $170 billion, according to the governor's Department of Finance, to flow through our state budget and go out to communities across the state in the 25-26 fiscal year. That is obviously a lot of money. I also want to point out that's not all the federal funding that comes to California, right? So the postal carrier who delivers your mail, they're not getting paid through the state budget. Grandma's Social Security check, not coming through the state budget. So there's a lot of federal funding, hundreds of billions of dollars that comes off budget, so to speak, outside of California's budget process. But still, there is a good chunk of change here coming from the feds that actually flows through our state budget process and is appropriated as part of that process. Then, of course, naturally, it is our state budget. So we have a lot of state funds, and that, of course, is the majority of our state budget. The state funds making up around 2/3 of the total state budget. And for the most part, this is where I'm leaving some details out just to let you know. The biggest component of that is what's called the general fund. That is the fund, whenever we're hearing that we have a surplus or a deficit, that's the fund everyone is talking about. That's like the state's major checking account from which most of our programs and services are funded. There's also a lot of special funds in California, well over 500. And that's the other major component of funding in this part of this donut chart, state funds. So now I wanted to drill down a little bit in terms of what those state dollars are going toward and what the federal dollars are going toward. Again, just as sort of a level setting exercise, so we're all on the same page. So if we look just at general fund and special fund spending in the governor's proposed budget, that's a little over $300 billion. Most of that is going to three places: Health and Human Services, K-12 education, and higher education. So if anyone's ever asking you, what is all that state funding going toward? You can tell them basically it's going toward Health and Human Services for Californians in need. That's largely our various safety net programs, and education from TK all the way through community colleges, the CSU, and the UC. So that's where most of the money is going that is budgeted as general fund or special fund spending. If we look, as we will, at the next chart, federal funding, the picture is dramatically different. Here, if we just look at those $170 billion in estimated federal funds that were at least as of the governor's proposal, are expected to come to California over the coming year, most of those dollars, around 80%, 4 and 5, are going to Health and Human Services. And a lot of you can probably guess when I say Health and Human Services, where most of the federal dollars are going within that category. It is to our state's Medi-Cal program, Medicaid at the federal level, which provides health, vision, dental, and behavioral health care to around 14 million Californians, a really critical program. So if folks are ever asking you, where are those federal dollars that are going, that flow through the state budget? Now you can say most of them are going to Health and Human Services, and within that category, the vast majority go to support our Medi-Cal program. Okay, a couple of other ways a couple of other key facts just to sort of set the context for the state budget. A lot of people, when they think about the state budget who haven't been around the process closely, will think about it as kind of one bill. Like, if they'll know what a bill is, they'll be like, yeah, there must be one bill, and that's the budget, right? Well, the reality is the budget is a package of bills. And there are three types of bills that are in the budget package in any given year. There are budget bills, trailer bills, and often other types of bills that get wrapped in or represented as being part of the overall architecture of the state budget. Now, I'm not going to drill down, as I normally would in this presentation, into the details of each of those types of bills. But what I wanted to do is just provide you a picture of that, a couple of ways of thinking about how large this budget package is. So the first way of thinking about it is to ask, how many budget-related bills did Governor Newsom sign into law during 2024? Well, the answer is more than 30. So the governor actually signed 7 budget bills into law, signed over 20 trailer bills. Just to tell you quickly, as a primer on that, the trailer bills are just changing state law in order to reflect the policy changes assumed in the state budget. So basically, they're policy bills by another name. They're changing state law. And then there were a couple of other bills that the governor signed that were considered to be related to the state budget package, but they weren't either budget bills or trailer bills. So in any given year, there's going to be a lot of bills in the budget package. And in years when things are really going south, we have a huge deficit to close. Luckily, we're not in that position this year. But in years when we have been in that position, we would have many more bills in the budget package. There have been years when we have had 40, 50, 60 plus bills in the budget package as policymakers have tried to resolve the budget problem that they were facing. Another way of thinking about the size of the budget package is to literally see how it stacks up. So this is my professional photo here of these bills that I was just telling you about, with a ruler next to them and be like, oh, how tall actually are they? So it's like 9 inches thick. So if you just stack all the bills side to side, you end up with a very thick packet. The longest bill was the 2024 Budget Act that clocks in at over 900 pages. And for those of you who aren't aware, bills can be very short. A bill can just be 1 page. In this case, the shortest bill in the budget package or in the bills, among the budget bills signed last year, was just 3 pages long. So wide variation in the length of bills, but when you stack everything up, there's a lot going on there. So just remember, the budget is always a package of bills, and that is what's deciding spending and policy changes through the budget in California. Okay, this is kind of a natural stopping point. And again, I can't see my audience, so I have no idea whether you have quizzical looks on your faces or if there's something I've said that isn't quite hitting home. So at this point, I will stop and ask if any questions have come in or if I should just continue on.
Hi, Scott. This is Matthew. According to our Q&A at the moment, we do not have any current questions.
Okay, great. Then I will soldier on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so at this point, I wanted to move to talking about the key players, the timeline, and how to get involved in the state budget process. The first place to start here is with the key players, and these folks are going to look very familiar to many of you. So obviously, we have Governor Newsom in his second and final term as governor. Really, he's got less than 2 years left in office. So he's obviously one of the key players. From the legislature's perspective, the key players are the leaders of each house. So first, there's Mike McGuire, who has been the leader of the state Senate for about a year now. And in the Assembly, Robert Rivas, who is the Assembly Speaker and has been in that position since, I think, the fall of 2023. Combined, these 3 folks are known as the Big Three simply because of the pivotal role that they play in the state budget process each year. So if you ever hear the term Big Three being thrown around in May or June, this is who folks are talking about. And then, of course, as I'll be talking about, the public also has a role to play in the budget process, which I will get to in a moment. Now, before I drill down into some of the specifics of what the governor's doing, what the legislature's doing, and the public's role, first, I want to just review some of the key state budget deadlines, 2 of which are in the state constitution and 1 of which is in state law. So on the left here is January 10th. Obviously, we just passed that date. It was 2.5 weeks ago that the governor, as required by the state constitution, introduced a balanced budget for the upcoming fiscal year starting on July 1st. So he actually did introduce it on January 10th. It could come out at any date before that. It has come out earlier in some years, but for the most part, governors will aim for that date as their release. Then in May, that is on May 14th, that is the date by which state law requires the governor to release a revised budget, which, at its most basic level is looking at the revenue situation for the upcoming fiscal year, updated estimates there, and some key spending decisions that need to be made as well. And then June 15th is a key date that is also set in the state constitution. That's the date by which the legislature needs to pass the initial budget bill for the upcoming fiscal year. They just have to pass the bill by midnight on June 15th. They don't have to pass any other bills. They don't have to pass trailer bills. It doesn't even matter what the governor does with the bill that they pass. The governor could veto the bill, and legislators will still have met their constitutional requirement to pass a budget bill by that required date, June 15th. Okay, so let's now look specifically at the roles of the governor, the legislature, and the public to have a better understanding of what they are all doing as part of the budget process. So we always like to point out that in California, the governor has the lead role in crafting our state budget. I lived in Texas for a number of years in the 90s, and it was an interesting situation because at least in Texas, the governor had a very limited role in the budget process. The legislature was in the driver's seat, and believe it or not, the lieutenant governor was one of the most powerful people in the state, which sounds weird when we're in California realizing we have a lieutenant governor with absolutely no power. So at least in other states, it may work somewhat differently like in Texas, but in California, the governor, through the Department of Finance, which leads the development of the governor's budget proposals and revisions each year, is a very powerful and central player in that process. And the governor essentially has three major bites at the apple. So the first, what we just saw a couple of weeks ago, is the governor gets to release a proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year. Now, obviously, that's a draft. It's not the final word, but it does give the governor a key leverage point and also the ability to sort of command the media attention. What does the governor think the problem is that we're facing? What is the governor's vision for California? What policy changes is the governor proposing? That's what everybody's talking about at that point. What did the governor do? Is it good? Is it bad? Do we like it or not? Great opportunity for the governor to set the stage for the kinds of priorities that he wants to see adopted, knowing that things will change. So one place we start to see changes then is a few months down the road. As I mentioned, the governor is required to release a revised budget known as the May revision. That's sort of like the governor's second bite at the apple here. And it comes at a very strategic time because it's the middle of May and the legislature, as I'll talk about in a bit, right? Well, I already mentioned that the legislature has to pass a budget bill by June 15th. But they have to start putting the budget bill together in early June or late May. And they also need to reach agreement amongst the Assembly and the Senate on what their plan is going to be. So when the May revision comes out, there is not a lot of time after that for the legislature to respond and figure out what their plan is going to look like in order to get the budget bill passed as required by the Constitution by June 15th. And then at the end of the process, once the governor and the legislative leaders, the big three, reach their final compromise deal on what the entire budget package is going to look like, that's typically mid to late June. The governor also has a lot of power here, right? I think a lot of you will know that the California Constitution allows the governor to line item veto appropriations, which means the governor can reduce or zero out any appropriation in any bill that has an appropriation. And it's not a power that is used a lot. We haven't seen it used much in recent years or even decades. But in theory, it does give the governor sort of a lot of power because it's like the governor sort of has the final say here. The reality is, though, especially when you have a Democratic governor and a Democratic-controlled legislature, they don't necessarily want to air a lot of dirty laundry, right? So it's, if I can use that phrase. So they work things out behind the scenes so that the governor doesn't feel like he has to come back around at the end of the process and start issuing a bunch of line item vetoes, right? So for the most part, they reach agreement among themselves and their sort of private negotiations. And there's not a lot of need then for the governor to swoop in and make a lot of line item vetoes. You can imagine, though, the situation would be a lot different. For example, if we had a Democratic-controlled legislature and a Republican governor, or vice versa. There we might be more likely to see line item vetoes, and we might even be more likely to see override attempts, which are very rare. I think you have to go back to the 1970s for the last time the legislature actually overrode a gubernatorial veto, and that was Jerry Brown in probably his second term. Okay, so that's sort of the role of the governor. Of course, the legislature has a very key role in this process as well. They are reviewing, revising, and adding to the governor's proposals, and they are getting help from the incredible folks at the Legislative Analyst's Office, or LAO, as it's called around Sacramento. So the key players here, starting on the left, there's Senator Scott Wiener. He is the chair of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. Over on the right is Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, who is the chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, right? They have slightly different names. They do pretty much exactly the same thing across those two committees in the two houses. And then in the center is Gabe Petek, who is the legislative analyst. Basically, he is hired by the legislature, and he leads a team who provide nonpartisan fiscal and policy advice to the state legislature. So the LAO works for the legislature, answers to the legislature. They do not answer to the governor's administration. And so that has been very helpful over the many decades that the LAO has existed in helping the legislature to boost its ability, its analytical ability, so that they can sort of match, at least in some ways, the executive branch, which has, of course, an incredible array of resources at its disposal. Each of the budget committees has subcommittees, as you can see noted on this slide. There are 5 in the Senate and 7 in the Assembly. And those subcommittees are important because that's where most of the action is happening in the legislature in terms of the review of the governor's proposals and thinking through the legislature's own budget plan. So these budget subcommittees in both houses combined, they're holding dozens of hearings, generally getting started later in February, definitely March and April and into May, and even after the May revision. They're holding hearings to try to figure out what is the governor's plan about, right? They're sort of dissecting it across a broad range of areas. So there's a health subcommittee, there's a human services subcommittee, education. They're all looking at the various aspects of the governor's proposal, trying to understand the proposals, maybe poking holes in it with the help of the LAO, trying to get a sense of where is it that the Assembly and the Senate would like to move with their own versions of the plan. Because the reality is the legislature, of course, is not there to rubber stamp the governor's proposals, but there often is a lot of agreement, especially when they're from the same party and they're more or less seeing eye to eye, right? The legislature approves a lot of what the governor proposes in January and in May, but they don't approve everything. They can modify things, they can reject things. The legislature can add entirely new programs and funding if they want. They can try to raise taxes on their own if they really wanted to. So they do have a lot of authority. The question is, how much of that authority do they feel like they want to use or are able to use in any given year? And at the end of the line, what they're trying to do is really develop their own spending plans that will differ from the governor's approach in many key ways. And they also need to come together and figure out, okay, we have an Assembly plan and a Senate plan. How do we line those up so we have a unified legislative plan? So we're going into final negotiations with the governor with both houses on the same side instead of sort of a three-way argument among 3 people. Okay, so let me move on to the public's role here. Clearly, there are a lot of ways for the public to have their voice heard in the process. And we will typically highlight some obvious things here in our budget process trainings. The first is clearly there are ways to submit support or opposition letters. The Assembly and Senate budget committees have very clear ways of doing that through their website. So that is a very common way for advocates to make their voice heard on various issues in the budget process. Public comment periods also are a good way to sort of have an opportunity to get in front of members of a subcommittee in a public setting. The reality is there's not a lot of time often provided for public comment, especially if hundreds of people are lined up. So it may be a quote, Me Too scenario where you get to the mic and you state your name, your organization, and your position on something, and then you shuffle along and the next person comes up. So that is an opportunity, maybe not the greatest opportunity. And then often the subcommittee staff, they are filling out their committee hearings with panels, right? People are sitting up there talking about various issues on the agenda that they are there to hear. And they will often, the staff will often reach out to advocates and others to participate in the hearing sort of from a testimony perspective. So that is another opportunity for many advocates to have somewhat maybe bigger microphone at a hearing, right? Instead of a Me Too, you're getting 2, 3, or 4 minutes to make your case for whatever the issue is at the hearing. But as you know, what I'm about to say is not going to be a surprise to any of you, that if advocates who really want to influence what's going on in and around the Capitol have to focus on building relationships with policymakers and with the people who work for them. Clearly, that doesn't just apply to politics in Sacramento. It applies across a broad range of areas, right? If you're not building relationships, you're digging yourself into a hole. So, but it's really crucial within the Capitol and the surrounding, everyone involved in the budget process. The Capitol is running on relationships. It really is a case of who you know, because if you don't know the right people and haven't established the relationships, it's going to be really hard to have your voice taken seriously or to have your proposals move forward at the time you would like them to. Building relationships, I'll just say up front, it's not easy, but it can happen throughout the year. There's no reason to say, oh, I don't have an opportunity to build a relationship now. There will always be opportunities, but the reality is fall can often be the best time, just because it's not like people don't have anything to do. Everyone's always going to be busy to some extent, but folks will be more willing and able to take a coffee meeting or jump on Zoom for an introductory conversation to learn about you, your issues, the things you want to see moving forward in the coming year or maybe the coming weeks. And then, the point about the last point on here about an advocate's work never being done, that is really true. There, as many of you I'm sure are aware, there's a lot of moving around between the legislature and the administration and all different kinds of spots within state government. And so you may establish a great relationship with, a committee, the Senate Budget Committee Consultant on Health, and then they move into the administration. So that's great that you still know them, but now you have to get to know that new Budget Committee staffer on health. So really, it's sort of an endless process just because there's a lot of turnover and moving around. So the work of relationship building never ends. All right. Closing in now on my final slides. Now I wanted to get a little bit more into the timeline, but the first thing that I want to emphasize, that we always emphasize in these trainings, is that the budget process is not a linear process with obvious stop and start dates. Some people think, oh, it must start on January 10th and it must end on June 15th or thereafter, sometime thereafter, right? It's like, no. The reality is, it's a cyclical process, and there is no off season for the state budget, if you want to think about it in sport terms, right? There's someone in Sacramento who is always thinking about the state budget, which means there are always opportunities for folks who want to influence the process to get involved. So it's not just a January to June thing, it's a January to December thing. If we break it up into 3 distinct periods, we at the Budget Center think about it in these 3 periods: July to December, January to May, which is the period we're in right now, and mid-May to June. So July to December, this is really the quietest period. There is a lot going on behind the scenes. The executive branch is developing the governor's budget for the following January 10th. The legislature's leaders are trying to figure out their budget priorities. And there's also a lot of, quote, budget cleanup that happens in August, which is basically making revisions to the budget that they just passed in June. And they can be very substantial policy changes. So in August, the legislature and governor will make, they will correct things, right, that maybe there were some errors in a trailer bill or in the budget bill itself. So things like that will get corrected in August. But they also make very significant policy changes as well as funding changes in August. So those things are all happening in this July to December period. Probably most stuff that's going on is going on behind the scenes. And so that is where it's really important to have those contacts already built in so that you know who to be talking to at various points of the process to have your voice heard. January to mid-May, which is where we are now, mid-May to June, which is where we'll be in a few months. I'll talk about those a little bit later, more high level in a next step slide that I have, which is, oh, actually, it's right here. This is kind of new. I just created this for this presentation to kind of consolidate some things. So where are we going from here? So heading into February right now and through early May, as I mentioned, this is all about budget subcommittee hearings. There will be dozens of hearings. They're all public. All the agendas are online. It's just a matter of navigating the websites of the Assembly Budget Committee and the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. By May 14th, as I noted, that's the governor's May revision. Revised budget will come out. What's happening toward the end of May? Well, legislative leaders are trying to figure out what is their unified approach to the state budget, because they need to get their budget bill to Leg Council by late May or very early June, because it's going to take 10 to 12 days to get that thing ready for it to be voted on the floors of each house around, let's say, June 13th, 14th, or maybe the 15th if they're pushing it. So there's a lot of lead time they need in order to get themselves ready to pass that initial budget bill by June 15th. But of course, negotiations are still happening behind the scenes with the governor during this entire period. And what's been happening over the last few years is after the legislature passes their initial budget bill, within days of that, an announcement is made that there is a deal, a three-way deal. The big three have agreed on a compromise budget package for the upcoming fiscal year that starts on July 1st. They will typically have another budget bill that will reflect changes, and all the trailer bills will be released at that point at once. And then late June into July, the legislature will have passed all these bills. The governor then is signing them all. Some of them get signed into law in July. And as I noted, they will come back a couple months later and make changes to the package that has just been signed into law a couple months before in June. So I think that, yes, so that ends my formal sort of overview of the budget process from the Budget Center perspective. Before I close out and see if there are any questions, I wanted to let you know that we do have a lot of awesome resources on our website. So if you haven't had a chance to go to the Budget Center's website, I would encourage you to do that. We would love to be your go-to source on budget and policy issues. We put out our first look publication analyzing the governor's proposed budget a couple of weeks ago. And we have our big annual conference, Policy Insights, coming up on April 10th in Sacramento at the Convention Center. So if you haven't been to that, that's a great opportunity to come and spend a day with us learning about some of the major policy issues and considerations on tap this year in California as well as in Washington, D.C. And I also wanted to highlight that we have this awesome new resource that we just unveiled a couple of weeks ago called our Budget Academy, where for the first time we are pulling together all of our process-related materials that have kind of been scattered on our website in the past. They now exist on this new Budget Academy webpage. And if you sign up, you'll get our state budget process infographic shared with you. So if you haven't seen the Budget Academy yet, please take a look. I'm going to be working to build it out in the coming weeks, months, and years. And I would welcome any ideas you have on potential resources that you would like to see in order to help yourselves and other Californians better understand budget and policy processes in California. So I'm getting ready to close us out, and I'm going to circle back to where we started. What is the state budget about? What should it reflect? Here's what I want everybody to remember coming out of this presentation. It is about our values and priorities as Californians. So with that, I am through the presentation. Thank you so much for inviting me into this space, allowing me to share some of the Budget Center's thinking around the important aspects of the budget process. And now, if in between munching on your lunch, you had time to think about any questions or you wanted to make any comments, I'm happy to hang out for as long as needed. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for the presentation. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Luis asks, do the budget subcommittees have any powers, or are hearings just informational? A little bit more background on this, the budget subs, please.
Oh, what the subcommittee? So yeah, budget subcommittee here. Yeah, the budget subcommittees are actually making decisions. For the most part, like through February all the way through the May revision, they're not actually making decisions. They're, quote, holding open the items that they are hearing, because everybody is really waiting for the governor's revised budget, because things are going to change at that point. So nobody is interested in making a lot of final decisions early on. There may be some things that they vote on, but ultimately the subcommittee chairs and the members are voting on their, for the budget items that fit within their purview. They ultimately are voting on all those items and deciding whether to move them forward, how to move them forward, or to reject them. And of course, they're doing that in consultation with the chair of each budget committee, also with the leadership of each house. So there's a lot of course, conversations that are going on behind the scenes, but it is the budget committees where that action is occurring in terms of not just hearing things, but actually voting on what's going to make it into each house's package.
Thank you, Scott. And the second question we have from Tim is, how would you assess the legislature's current track record on oversight of state spending? Does the legislature do enough, or could it do more to track how money is being spent and whether that spending is meeting policy objectives?
Yes.
A couple points.
Yeah, no, that is a really good question. I do think it's fair to, and actually, just to be honest with you, I have heard from folks in the Capitol that they would also like to be doing more oversight. It's very easy to approve additional appropriations. It's a lot harder to know whether the funding that's being provided is actually meeting the goals that were intended when the appropriation was approved. So there definitely is a role for oversight and trying to understand whether investments are actually meeting the expectations at the time that they were approved. I can give you one example of that. If I may mention tax expenditures, which are basically, a lot of breaks and loopholes that have been added to California's tax system across the decades. We have tens of billions of dollars in lost revenue every year to these tax expenditures, most of which are benefiting wealthy Californians and very profitable corporations. And we have been saying for years that basically constitutes a shadow budget, right? That it's not part of the normal budget process to look at these tax expenditures and ask if they are meeting the hopes and dreams that anyone had when they approved them originally. They just sort of end up being on autopilot and no one asks questions about them again. So there's a lot of lost revenue. We think that's an example of a place where the legislature has a great opportunity to be digging into key tax expenditures and asking, are they meeting the needs that we thought we had when we approved them? I am sorry if you're hearing a loud horn in the background. Light rail is right outside my office, and there must be someone parked on the tracks. And so it's giving me a little bit of a headache right now as I'm trying to talk.
Yeah, Scott, I appreciate that. We have one last question that just came up, and no worries about the light rail.
I don't know if you can hear it. You may not even be able to hear it, but it was very loud in my office.
Absolutely. So this last one is more just holistically speaking. So one goal of HPPA is to make the state budget process accessible to communities. What are the opportunities for the community to get involved in the process to make the budget more accessible?
It was a little hard to hear that question. I'm sorry, you ended up being a little muffled for some reason.
My apologies. Let me try this again. So one goal of HPPA is to make the state budget process accessible to communities. So what are the opportunities for the community to get involved in the budget process?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of opportunities through sort of existing coalitions that work on particular areas of the budget. So I think one way to get involved without feeling like you're just sort of on your own is to, first identify, well, what is it that we're most interested in changing? What is our value? What do we want to see prioritized in the state budget? And once that determination has been made, then the question would be, well, who else is working on that? And there's a very good chance that whatever you may want to work on, someone else is already thinking about it and has probably been working on it for years or maybe decades. There are coalitions built around various issue areas in California, everything from health to safety net programs, to K-12 education, to environment. So there are a lot of coalitions and advocacy organizations already out there and available for folks to plug into, so people don't have to feel like they're reinventing the wheel or starting from scratch. So I guess that's one thing I would suggest, is just sort of dial in, what is it that we actually want to see accomplished through the state budget process? And then where are our allies? Who in the advocacy space is already doing this work? How can we connect with them? How can we plug in and help make that work even stronger through our participation? And of course, there is always the other option, which is just start reaching out on your own to key legislators, right? Like start to build those relationships with staff, with members of the legislature, with the chair of the subcommittee that covers an issue that you care most about. So all of this, there's lots of ways to go about this, but I guess, my first bit of advice would be, rather than going it alone or feeling like you have to start from scratch, try to find out who your potential allies are and plug in with them, and then get the work done that way.
Thank you, Scott. Looks like we got a couple more questions that have just come in. So we got a couple more minutes if you're interested.
Can I just say, because of the light rail horn, there was one thing I wanted to say about an earlier question. Is there time for me to do that?
Absolutely.
Sorry?
Please. Yes, absolutely, please.
Oh, great. Sorry, I didn't hear you there. So yes, so the other thing to think about in terms of this question someone had asked about oversight of state spending, I think the other reality to keep in mind, that this is what I wanted to raise, was that there's a lack of resources within the state capitol and basically within the legislative branch to do a lot of this oversight. Like if you think about the size of our state budget, the Assembly Budget Committee has, I think, maybe 9 or 10 very hardworking consultants who are trying to cover the entire state budget. Similar on the Senate side. The Legislative Analyst's Office, they've got more staff, but they don't have the number of staff that they need in order to really be able to dig in and do the kind of oversight that would truly be needed, right? Get off the treadmill of just let's analyze what's going on this particular year, but be able to look more broadly at are our dollars working the way we want them to? And the state auditor does this to some degree, but it also would be useful to happen within the legislature itself and within the Legislative Analyst's Office. That presumes higher staffing levels and more funding. And there you start to bump into the restrictions on funding for the legislature that the voters passed back in the, late 80s, or I think early 90s, when they approved term limits. They also deeply slashed the budget of the legislature and made it very challenging for the legislature as an institution to actually be able to do a lot of this oversight, which I wanted to clarify. We have heard that the legislature, key folks in the legislature, are interested in doing more oversight. The problem is they don't have the resources and the staff to make that happen in the way they would like to.
Thank you, Scott. So the next two questions are related to the January 10th deadline for the governor's budget. So for anyone wishing to have their budget plan considered for that budget for the upcoming year, is it too late to get it to the governor if done after the January 10th deadline? And is it possible for the governor to add new budget proposals, perhaps BCPs from the agencies, to the January 10th submitted budget? Would this be part of the revision process?
Yes, so too late for trying to influence January 10th, clearly, but this is all sort of, not everything is open to negotiation, but you don't know unless you ask, right? So there will always be opportunities to meet with key folks in the administration, and assuming you have the contacts, right? So that's the thing where it comes to like relationship building. But if you have the contacts, meet with folks, a lot of folks in the administration, they do want, maybe not everyone, but a lot of them, most of them want honest feedback about proposals that were made on January 10th. Sometimes these proposals are made and they know that they're going to need some work. And so advocates can provide some constructive criticism during February, March, and April, right, as the governor's Department of Finance and other agencies in the executive branch are trying to figure out what is our approach to the May revision going to be, right? We're going to make some changes in some ways based on what we know about revenues, what we're learning about the proposals we made in January, what we're hearing from the legislature and from advocates. So there will always be opportunities to meet with administration officials and push them to do things in a different way. And those are the things, if they're accepted, of course, will end up in the May revision. Sometimes the administration doesn't want to budge on something. And there, of course, you're playing, it's three or multi-dimensional chess here, right? It's like you're not just dealing with the governor's administration, of course, you're not ignoring the legislature. You need to be in there with the assembly, with contacts in the Senate, and trying to assess the extent to which you can get an idea that didn't make it into the January proposal. Maybe it can become part of the legislature's own version of the budget, right? Because they're going to have a budget that doesn't look exactly like the governor's proposals. They're going to have their own plan. And so there are opportunities there to try for advocates to try to build their ideas into the legislature's plan. The reality this year, though, is it's been getting more challenging, I've been hearing in recent years, to do these things, just because we've had some revenue constraints. This year, we have all the uncertainty, around what's going on in Washington, D.C. and what federal policy funding cuts, policy changes and funding cuts might mean for California, for our budget, for Californians across multiple, communities across the state. So there may not be the same kind of willingness this year as there have been in prior years to entertain new proposals, new ideas, building on what we, building new things into the budget. It just may be harder. I guess it's just a note of a reality check that it could be harder this year than it has been in prior years to do that, simply because so much is unknown. And we're not going to have a true sense of the federal situation until we get through the next couple of months and we see what's really on deck coming out of Congress, coming out of the Trump administration, because then we'll have a sense of, okay, are they proposing draconian cuts to Medicaid, which would represent a cost shift to California potentially of $10 or $20 billion per year? If that happens, then that sucks all the air out of the room in terms of, hey, what new great policy proposals can we advance in California? It's more like, how do we shore up healthcare coverage for 14 million Californians if it looks like we're going to take a $10 or $20 billion federal funding hit? So just to note that this is an odd year in the sense that the state budget situation itself is pretty calm. It's all the unknowns, or most of the unknowns, are coming from Washington, D.C. and what may or may not happen in the next couple of months. I hope that was helpful as an answer to that question. I might have gone a little far afield, but hopefully I answered it.
Well, thank you, Scott. I think it looks like we in the chat are seeing that, yes, you did answer the question.
Oh, good. Thank you.
It looks like we have one more question. We might have time for two altogether. So if there's any other questions, like final thoughts want to come in, please feel free to share them in the chat, or the Q&A, excuse me. And the last question we currently have refers to more about applying for jobs in the field. So in terms of applying for a job in the budget field, in areas perhaps with the Department of Finance or with an advocacy group such as yours, when would be the best time to apply, and who would be the best point of contact to try to get to an entry-level role?
Entry level. Okay. We do a lot of informational interviews. I don't know how popular they are across state government, but if you're interested in learning more about my organization or about nonprofit research, I would be more than happy to chat with any of you. So just feel free to I'm easy to find. Feel free to reach out to me. In terms of because and of course, keep in mind, I don't work for the state. I work for a private nonprofit. So with, the behemoth of state government, I'm sure there's a lot of ways that these things happen. If you're not on social media, whether you want to be or not, you kind of have to be. So LinkedIn, I've also been more active on Blue Sky, getting away from Twitter, as it was formerly known. But I think most of you probably are on LinkedIn. I would encourage you to beef up your LinkedIn profiles. Watch for opportunities, follow like the Department of Finance, the Legislative Analyst's Office, other agencies you're interested in. I see job postings all the time. I'm not going to apply to them, but sometimes I will forward them, I'll repost them, I'll share them with people I know. So there are a lot of job and I think entry-level job opportunities that are showing up on LinkedIn from various state agencies and departments. So I would encourage you to not just reach out to me, but go a little bit more broadly and use social media can be your friend here. And if you have contacts within any of these departments, you should be using those as well.
Yeah, and it looks like the LAO is hiring fiscal and policy analysts currently. And I wanted to go ahead and lean on Sylvia real quick, who has her hand up, probably wants to mention something as well.
Yes, I just want to mention that from the executive branch's perspective, each of the many departments under the purview of the governor have a budget shop. So that process that Scott said, it's year round. In the budget shops for each of the departments, it's truly year round. At any given time, the budgeteers are working on 3 different fiscal years. The past fiscal year, trying to close it, the current fiscal year, trying to spend, and the budget year +1, as is generally referred to, is preparation for it. This budget shops are constantly hiring. But I am going to ask a question of our participants today. Is that an area that the HPPA can assist and perhaps have a lunch and learn on how to obtain a state job? You can go ahead and just put your yes or no on the chat box. Thank you for the time.
And while y'all are thinking about that, I just wanted to give, a gracious thank you to Scott for this presentation and just a plug for future HPPA chapter events. As we said earlier, this is the first in the series that we were doing on this to help dig in and understand the budget. As the, budget conversations continue, please look out for further of our series coming up. And with that being said, again, thank you very much, Scott. We are going to wrap up now. And look forward to having everyone join us in the future.
Great, thank you. And thank you again for inviting the Budget Center to participate. And again, feel free, all of you, to follow up with me at any point. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, y'all. Enjoy. Thank you for joining us for lunch. We look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.